On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was moving quickly around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. It was a Tuesday morning, and the house was filled with the usual sounds of a family getting ready for the day. Her husband, Barry, stood at the kitchen sink, his back to her, methodically washing the last of the breakfast dishes. Charlotte reached past him, opening a cupboard to grab her favorite coffee mug. They were both preparing for busy days. Charlotte was a well-respected administrator for the local school district, and Barry was not only the head of the local National Guard Armory, but also the acting mayor of their small, tight-knit community of about 9,000 people. As Barry finished with the dishes and turned from the sink to go find his briefcase in the dining room, Charlotte was pouring herself a cup of coffee. She reminded him that she had a hair appointment scheduled for later that morning. She also mentioned that she would probably be home later than usual that evening. The reason was a difficult meeting she had with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately caught in the middle of a messy legal battle with her own cousin, a man named Wayne. The dispute was over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. Her uncle had passed away and left a significant amount of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne felt that he deserved a piece of that land too, and so he was formally contesting the will. Today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all supposed to sit down in a room together and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry paused by the doorway and asked Charlotte if she had decided what she was going to say at the meeting, what her position was going to be. Charlotte just shook her head and told him no, that she was still turning it over in her mind. On one hand, she knew she didn't want to just give up the land that her uncle had specifically willed to her, but on the other hand, she was deeply worried about the conflict tearing her family apart over money. It was a heavy weight on her shoulders. Barry walked back over to her and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. He looked her in the eyes and reassured her that whatever happened, whatever she decided, their family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his things, and then he left for work. Once Barry's car had pulled out of the driveway, Charlotte took a deep breath, finished her coffee, and headed upstairs. She walked down the hallway and knocked softly on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles tapped the wood, she heard a low groan from inside the room. Charlotte slowly opened the door and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and pale. Now, Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. Kara was pregnant, and for the past several weeks, she had been dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. To say Charlotte was not thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant would be an understatement. But it wasn't just the pregnancy itself. More than anything, she was deeply unhappy because she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank, he had a history of getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he just wasn't the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara had gotten pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave at all. They had laid down the law and said the relationship was over. But, like many teenagers, Kara hadn't listened. She and Dave had continued to see each other in secret, and now, here they were, expecting a baby. Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she was also a mother, and she knew that Kara was going to need a lot of support, not just to finish her senior year of high school, but to navigate the incredible challenge of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was trying her best to just keep the peace within the family. With that in mind, she stepped fully into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under her blankets and said she was okay, just feeling a little nauseous again. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She spent a moment tidying up some clothes in the room, and then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She told Kara it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara said that she had a babysitting job that would take up most of her day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said she loved her, and then explained that she had to get going to work. Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte was driving back down her quiet, tree-lined residential street toward her house. She lived in a very respectable upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime in the area had been extremely low, almost non-existent. Although, more recently, there had been a small string of daytime robberies in the area, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt very safe in their home. Charlotte was having a particularly hectic day. Her morning at the school district office had been incredibly busy, packed with meetings and paperwork. From there, she had driven straight to the salon for her scheduled haircut. And in just a little while, she had to be back at her office for a few more hours of work before her big, stressful afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled, a bit too perfect. So her plan was to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before she headed back to work to finish out her day. She pulled her car into the garage, shut off the engine, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. As she was standing in front of the mirror, plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a distinct sound from downstairs. It was the sound of a door opening. The sound surprised her because she knew she was supposed to be alone in the house. She had assumed Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and her husband, Barry, almost never came home for his lunch break. Confused, she set the blow dryer down on the counter and walked out of the bathroom to go and see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, Heather, pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that evening. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something that struck her as a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had talked to her mom on the phone just the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock because of her late meeting. Heather didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe the meeting got canceled, she thought. So she just grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. As she walked into the open garage to make her way into the house, she noticed something else that was strange. The interior door that led from the garage into the kitchen was already open, but just a crack. This was definitely unusual. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And now, a small feeling of unease began to creep in. Sensing that maybe something was off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open the rest of the way. She called out, "Mom," wanting to see what she was doing, but there was no answer. The house was silent. So Heather stepped into the quiet kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began to walk through the first floor of the house, looking for her mom. She didn't hear her, and she couldn't see her anywhere. She was just walking from room to room, calling out her mom's name. And then, as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the main staircase, completely still and motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side, dropping to her knees and grabbing her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold. A wave of panic washed over her. She scrambled back to her feet, ran into the other room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and frantically dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department was speeding down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to the 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled his patrol car up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out of the front door, crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter quickly stopped his car, got out, and intercepted the young woman, who he would soon learn was Heather. She begged him to come inside and help her mom. So, Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. As they reached the front porch, he gently told her to stay outside while he went in to investigate. She complied, staying out on the front lawn, quietly weeping to herself while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a grand staircase. She was completely motionless. Nearby, the contents of a purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. Carter stood back up and began to assess the scene more carefully. The first thing he noticed was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. His initial thought was that maybe she had suffered a seizure or some kind of sudden, severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs, lost her balance, and tragically fallen down. The fall could have killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw what were clearly scratch marks on her chin. He also saw a dark, angry-looking red mark around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had not just fallen down the stairs. It was very likely she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he had been methodically scouring the entire house, which was now an active crime scene, looking for any possible clues. And now, he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots that looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and instructed him to take the towels into evidence. He couldn't be sure yet if the blood was even Charlotte's, but if it was, it could be a very important clue. After searching the whole house from top to bottom, Carter had developed a pretty strong working theory about what had happened to Charlotte. He had found no signs of forced entry anywhere, and all the obvious valuables, like the television and other electronics, were still in the home. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but her cash and all of her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So, Carter did not believe this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the end as a weak attempt to make it look like a robbery to throw the police off their trail. This did not seem like a random act of violence. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from the direction of the front door. So, he went to see what was going on. When he got to the foyer, he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by 2 forensics officers. And then, after a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry was distraught and pushed past them. And as soon as he got inside, he saw what they were trying to shield him from, his wife's body, lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently took Barry by the arm and led him into the adjacent living room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't. Barry was gasping for air, really struggling to breathe. And then he suddenly doubled over and clutched at his chest. For a moment, Carter thought he might be having a heart attack. So instead of trying to talk to him or ask him any questions, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the brightly lit lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse informed him that he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the mayor, but because he really needed to talk to him. This was the spouse of a potential murder victim. He needed to know what Barry knew, what he had seen, and what his day had been like. So he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. He recognized one of them as Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day when Heather was the one who had come running out and directed him into the house. They had talked a little bit, but she had been too upset to provide much information. Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough now that we can have a real conversation. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up, and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that indicated it was okay for him to come and sit down. So Carter walked over and sat down in the chair next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting on the other side of Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. And then he asked both women how their dad was doing. Heather explained that the doctors so far believed he had not had a heart attack. They thought it was likely a severe panic attack, but they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't done anything suspicious, really, but Carter knew that he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his small notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already done some preliminary work. They had learned that Charlotte had left her office around 11 in the morning that day. It wasn't until about 1 in the afternoon that her concerned coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to work. They said that there was no answer when they called. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime within that 2-hour window between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. So, with that in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been that morning and afternoon, with a specific focus on that 11 to 1 time frame. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day for a family on the other side of town. And Heather said that she had been at her college, which was a good 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, which was when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother, or who might have wanted to hurt her, or who might have been happy if something bad happened to her. And the girls immediately shook their heads and said, absolutely not, there was no one. They insisted their mom was a wonderful person, that everybody seemed to like her, and that they were a happy, normal family. They said there were no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while driving to work that morning, and since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was the only thing anybody in town could talk about. So Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case, and to solve it quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have possibly been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. And so now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, that none of those interviews had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who would likely be able to help them the most, at least at this point in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband. But he was still in the hospital and was therefore not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the others were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting across from each other in Carter's small office. Barry said that he had just been released from the hospital. The doctors had determined that his heart was fine and that he really had just suffered from a severe panic attack. He said that as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. And so Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barber shop had been closed, so he had just gone right back to work. He said he had stayed there until around 4:30, which was when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather telling him that their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was actually primarily just looking at Barry's hands and arms. He was looking to see if there were any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on the evidence they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a significant fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably, there should be defensive wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, there were no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple. He seemed very earnest about it and genuinely eager to help. And so, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he was not a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was a grieving husband telling the truth. At some point, Carter kind of shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea about who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said, yes, he did. He said there were actually two people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He said the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was actually their daughter, Kara's boyfriend. He explained that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was kind of a bad influence, but the teens had kept. And so Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had just gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. And that's when Barry brought up the inheritance dispute. He explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this very contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair because he thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin Wayne was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had immediately responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had made Carter pretty suspicious, because during that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he pretty much leaned right in and began to grill Wayne. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said that he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. And Wayne said that the last time he had spoken to Charlotte, she had seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had told him that she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all of the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised, because Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work truly all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish, and he just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there at the station. When Carter asked him if he knew why he'd been called in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. And so Carter actually just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents, and Dave would admit that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted that he would never hurt Charlotte, or Barry for that matter. He also said he hadn't even been in town on the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day at a landscaping job miles and miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints, to which Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time." But he said he would do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And as he read, he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the long, decorative strings that dangled from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist from the struggle. Now, this level of extreme violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the other evidence seemed to paint a different picture entirely. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was actually unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of potential suspects was basically down to 0. So if Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him that they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a familiar dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this dedicated tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down to a crawl. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just baseless rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they had looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but it turned out he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had once strangled his girlfriend in a manner that was eerily similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had a solid alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to the neighboring state of Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had been bragging at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this small-time criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get the guy in trouble. Also, in addition to all these new potential suspects having alibis, none of their prints matched the unidentified prints that had been found at the crime scene. And to add even more confusion to this, a fingerprint expert had told Carter that it was actually possible that those third prints could belong to a child. And so maybe they were totally unrelated to the murder altogether. And so now, as Carter looked over at this desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just taken, Carter just braced himself for more bad news because all these tip line calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the case. And as difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was already feeling, that local residents were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, it was a low blow. But Carter also understood their frustration because he was actually feeling just as upset and helpless as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this particular day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial massive wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the case had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to try and move on with their lives without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. And in fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife, Charlotte. And even though this opponent had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he claimed to have had a dream about it, all the media attention from these wild accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And so, calls had once again begun flowing into this tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these new tips were just more wild theories and local gossip. But that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up the door to Carter's office, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Like whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said that he had just spoken to two tipsters who clearly had some real, concrete information that they wanted to share. Information that he said was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, as well as forensic evidence and witness testimony, this is what police now believe happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the open garage. And when they saw it, their heart raced with a dark excitement because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had gotten here at exactly the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they got out, and they walked up into the garage. They walked over to the interior door that led into the house, and they tried the handle, and they found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. So the killer closed the door behind them, they went around to the main staircase that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them. And Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them standing there in her house in the middle of a weekday. But the killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank, and when she answered the question, it was not the answer the killer wanted to hear. And so the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then the killer just totally lost their temper and struck Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring out of Charlotte's nose, and stunned, she just kind of stumbled back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with. Now, at this point, the killer knew that they had crossed a line, and so persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a white towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight, tight around her neck. And so Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, scratching and clawing, but the killer absolutely had her in this chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her with all their might down the long staircase. And when the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte lying in a heap at the base of the stairs, obviously motionless and very likely dead, the terrible reality of what they had just done, it hit them. And so, in a blind panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor upstairs. They rushed down the stairs and they quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, trying to erase any evidence of the initial struggle. Then they ran into the laundry room and dumped the bloody towels in with the other dirty laundry. Then they went back and grabbed Charlotte's purse off the nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping that the police would think that this was just a random robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed that they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's acting mayor, and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. It turned out that Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he desperately needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and to split the inheritance with her cousin to keep peace in the family. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped, and he killed his wife. It wasn't just because he was angry at her for her decision. It was also because he needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy. And then, between the two, I'll have more than enough money to pay off all of my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim on Charlotte's life insurance policy, because Barry was so early on in the investigation, clearly a suspect in his wife's murder, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their two daughters, Heather and Kara. But a couple of years later, Barry, still desperate for money, tried to get his hands on it by tricking his own daughters into signing the money over to him. But when Heather and Kara realized what their father was trying to do, they finally saw him for what he truly was. And so it was the daughters who were the tipsters who finally broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior around the time of the murder, along with his clear financial motives. They also told him that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police, and that he had even called in fake tips himself to try and redirect the investigation away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The two daughters, Heather and Kara, had to make the unimaginable choice to turn in their own father, all to get justice for the mother that he had stolen from them. They lost both of their parents on that terrible day in August, one to violence and the other to his own greed and deception. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the night of the 25th of April, 1977, on a small, uninhabited island off the coast of Brazil, a man named Apollinario awoke on his boat to the sound of a blood-curdling scream. He scrambled outside onto the deck and found his brother, Orianiano, writhing in agony. His skin was covered in the most horrific burns Apollinario had ever seen, as if it had been literally set on fire and was now peeling away from his body. But the truly impossible part, the detail that would haunt investigators for years, was that his brother's clothes were perfectly fine, completely untouched by any flame. Around 8 o'clock that evening, 31-year-old Apollinario Souza Correa had poured the last of their water onto the campfire he'd built with his three brothers, Firmino, Orianiano, and Jose. They were on a small beach on an island in northeast Brazil, a place the locals called Crab Island. For the four brothers, this island was their workplace. They were lumberjacks, and they would take their small boat out to Crab Island all the time to harvest wood, which they would then sell to local construction companies. It was hard work, but it was a good, honest living. And every single time they made the trip, they had the island completely to themselves. There was a very good reason for this. Most of their neighbors, the other people who lived in their small coastal town, believed that Crab Island was haunted. For generations, people who had dared to visit the island told unsettling stories. They would report hearing strange, disembodied voices whispering from deep within the forest, especially at night. Sometimes they'd see bizarre lights flashing and dancing silently above the treetops, even on the clearest of nights. But Apollinario and his brothers were practical men. They didn't put much stock in ghost stories and local legends. They had a family to feed, and the lumber on Crab Island was plentiful and profitable. The stories were just stories, something to scare children, and they weren't afraid. On this particular day, they had arrived at high tide sometime around noon. They moored their boat as close to the shore as they could, and then spent the entire afternoon working under the hot sun, chopping down trees, and preparing the lumber. As evening fell, the tide began to recede, pulling the water far out from the shore and leaving a vast muddy flat between the beach and the deeper water. Their boat was now sitting high and dry on the mud, completely stranded. This didn't concern them in the slightest. It was all part of their usual routine. They hadn't planned on sailing straight back home anyway. Their plan was to cook dinner over the fire, relax for a bit, and then sleep for a few hours on their boat right where it sat on the mudflats. They knew that while they were sleeping, the tide would come back in, lifting their boat gently off the mud. They could then wake up around midnight, refreshed and ready to make the journey home. And so, that's exactly what they did. After a long day of work, they ate their dinner by the warm glow of the campfire. Once they were done, Apollinario doused the fire, and the four brothers waded through the thick, cool mud over to their boat. They climbed aboard, went into the main cabin, and laid out their sleeping pads. Exhausted from the physical labor, it didn't take long for any of them to fall into a deep sleep. They had only intended to sleep until about midnight, just long enough for the tide to return. But when Apollinario's eyes flickered open, he could tell something was off. It was still dark inside the small cabin, but when he glanced out the tiny window, he saw the sky outside was already painted with the pink and orange hues of sunrise. He let out a low groan. They had all overslept. They'd completely missed high tide. Their boat had been lifted up by the water and then set right back down in the mud as the tide went out again. Now they were stuck, probably until noon when the next high tide would arrive. It was an annoying mistake, but just a nuisance. Apollinario sat up and looked over to see if his brothers were awake. He saw Firmino and Jose still fast asleep on their pads, their thin blankets pulled up over their faces to block out the morning light. But then he looked at his third brother's spot. Orianiano's sleeping pad was empty. He wasn't in the cabin. And just as Apollinario was registering this, a deafening, agonized scream ripped through the quiet morning air. It was coming from just outside the cabin, somewhere on the boat. Without a second thought, Apollinario jumped to his feet, threw open the cabin door, and ran outside. And that's when he found Orianiano. His brother was on the deck screaming, and he was covered from head to toe in the most severe burns Apollinario could imagine. Apollinario was so horrified he just froze in place for a moment. It looked like his brother's skin had literally been boiled or set on fire. It was red and blistering, and in some places just sloughing off. But then he noticed something even stranger, something that made no sense at all. Despite the horrific state of his brother's skin, Orianiano's clothes, his shirt, and his pants looked completely normal. There wasn't a single scorch mark on them. It was as if only his skin had somehow caught fire while everything else on him was left untouched. As his brother continued to scream in pure agony, Apollinario's mind raced, trying to understand what could have possibly happened. And in that moment of shocked paralysis, he heard a new sound. It was a low moaning, and it was coming from back inside the cabin. Acting purely on instinct, he turned and ran back inside. He knew his other two brothers, Firmino and Jose, were in there, their blankets still over their heads. He raced over to Firmino, who the moaning seemed to be coming from, and he pulled back the blanket. The sight was just as horrific as what he'd seen on deck. Firmino's skin was also terribly burned, falling off his body in sheets. And just like Orianiano, his clothes were not burned at all. He was just moaning, lost in a world of pain. Terrified, Apollinario looked over at his last brother, Jose, who was still lying on his sleeping pad. He wasn't burned, but he wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. He was dead. Because of the tides, Apollinario had to endure a full 6 hours of helplessness. 6 hours trapped on that island with his dead brother and his two other brothers suffering from unimaginable injuries. Finally, the tide came back in, lifting their boat from the mud. As soon as they were afloat, they took off. When they got back to the mainland, Orianiano, the brother who had been screaming outside, was badly hurt but seemed stable. He stayed behind with Jose's body, while Apollinario rushed Firmino to the hospital, whose injuries seemed far more critical. When they arrived at the hospital, Firmino was barely conscious. His body was shutting down from the shock and the pain of his burns. As doctors swarmed around him, they desperately tried to ask him what had happened, how he had gotten these burns. Just before Firmino slipped into a coma, he managed to whisper a few words. He told them that sometime during the night, while they were all asleep on the boat, he had looked out the cabin window, and hovering in the air just outside was an inexplicable, blinding ball of fire. That was all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. The police opened an investigation, but they were immediately stumped. They came up with several theories, none of which held much water. Maybe the brothers had gotten into a violent fight and were now lying about it. But there were no signs of a struggle on the boat or on the men themselves, aside from the burns. Maybe they had taken some kind of drug and had hallucinated or hurt themselves, but there was no evidence of any substance use. Another theory was that lightning had struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand or water and hit the boat. But weather reports showed a clear sky that night, with no storms anywhere in the region. The reality was, the police investigation found nothing. They scoured Crab Island for any clue, any piece of evidence that could explain what happened to the Souza Correa brothers. They found no footprints other than the brothers, no remnants of any device, no scorch marks on the boat or the surrounding area. There was simply no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured brothers, Firmino and Orianiano, would make full recoveries from their physical injuries. But their minds were scarred. Neither of them could ever remember any more meaningful details from that night. The case was eventually closed, the official cause of Jose's death undetermined, and the incident filed away as a tragic, unexplained mystery. But the strange stories from Crab Island continued. Locals kept reporting the phantom voices and the strange lights over the trees. And then, in April of 1986, 9 years after the death of Jose Souza Correa, another crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. At some point during their trip, all 4 men recalled hearing a loud crashing sound echo from the woods. And then, they all simultaneously fell unconscious. When they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of the men was dead. and another was inexplicably covered in severe burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors had absolutely no memory of what happened. On the night of the 12th of June, 1993, a 69-year-old man named Deke Slayton carefully climbed into his bed in his home in League City, Texas. Even this simple everyday action took an immense amount of effort for Deke. He was very, very sick. Deke had a brain tumor. He'd been diagnosed the year before and had actually gone into remission, giving him and his family a brief, hopeful period where they thought he had beaten it. But the cancer had returned a few months later, and this time it was far more aggressive. Deke knew this thing was going to kill him, and probably sooner rather than later. His wife and daughter were taking care of him around the clock as he grew weaker and sicker with each passing day. And while he was deeply grateful for their love and care, a part of him hated it. Deke Slayton was a tough, self-reliant man, and he was used to being the one who took care of others, not the other way around. But more than the weakness, more than the dependency, the single worst part of his illness was that he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. For Deke, flying was more than a hobby. It was who he was. He was a legend in the aviation community. As a young man, he had served in the Air Force, flying dozens of combat missions in World War II, enduring some of the most harrowing aerial combat in history. Deke loved being up in the sky, looking down at the world from his cockpit, so much so that after the war, he decided to go one step further to space. He became an astronaut, and not just any astronaut. He was one of the original Mercury 7, NASA's very first team of astronauts selected to journey beyond the Earth's atmosphere. After he got too old for spaceflight, he continued to work for NASA in other crucial roles until his retirement 10 years prior. But retiring from NASA didn't mean he stopped flying. He became a hugely successful amateur air racer, a competitive sport where powerful aircraft race each other through complex aerial obstacle courses. Now, as Deke felt his life slipping away, all he could think about, all he wanted to do, was fly. He had a special plane he used for racing called a Stinger. It was a small, red, incredibly loud aircraft, and he loved it dearly. He would lie in bed and fantasize constantly about getting back in that cockpit one last time. He knew, of course, that flying was impossible. The tumor had affected his balance and his decision-making. His speech was shaky, and he was exhausted all the time. It simply wasn't safe. On top of his physical limitations, his beloved Stinger plane was currently in storage hundreds of miles away. But as Deke lay in bed that night, feeling physically awful, feeling his life literally draining away, the desire for one more flight became an overpowering need. He made a decision right then and there. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning, sick or not, he was going to find a way to take his Stinger out and go for one last ride. Early the next morning, at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, over 1,500 miles away from where Deke Slayton lay in his bed, an airport manager stepped into his office to start his shift. He worked in the airport's noise abatement department, a job that was all about making sure the planes flying in and out didn't make too much noise and upset the local residents. Usually, this early on a Sunday morning, things were quiet and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager sat down at his desk, his phone began to ring. He answered it, and an angry local resident was on the other end, wanting to make a complaint. A plane had just been flying low over her house, making a tremendous amount of noise. The manager glanced at the clock on his wall. It was just before 8 a.m. This meant the plane the resident was complaining about was in clear violation of the airport's strict Sunday curfew. To keep the peace with their neighbors, the John Wayne Airport didn't allow any planes to take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays. The resident on the phone gave a clear description of the aircraft. It was a small, red, racing-style plane, a Stinger. The manager took down the details, hung up the phone, and was about to start looking into it when his phone rang again. It was another resident calling with the exact same complaint. And then another, and another. The calls kept flooding in, all about this loud red plane that was seen doing wild aerial maneuvers before it finally disappeared from the area. A few of the callers had even managed to get a close enough look at the plane to read its identification number painted on the tail. They had written it down. The number was N21X. As soon as the manager had a moment between calls, he typed that number into his computer system to see who the plane was registered to. When the name came up on the screen, the manager was shocked. The plane belonged to Deke Slayton. The manager knew who Deke was. Everyone in aviation did. And it was deeply surprising to him that a consummate professional like Deke Slayton would be flying so recklessly and in direct violation of the airport curfew. It just didn't make any sense. The manager then pulled up the morning's readings from the airport's automated noise monitors, which were placed in the neighborhoods surrounding the airport. The data was undeniable. At the exact time the residents had reported seeing Deke's plane, at least 3 of the monitors showed huge spikes in noise levels. At this point, the manager knew he had no choice. With corroborated eyewitness reports and physical data from the noise monitors, he would have to send the legend himself, Deke Slayton, a formal notice of violation. He was going to have to reprimand a national hero. But based on the reports and the monitor readings, it was clear that whatever Deke had been doing, he was done. The noise levels were back to normal, and the plane was gone. So while there was no huge urgency, the manager printed out the noise recordings, placed them in his to-do pile, and went about the rest of his day. 15 days later, that manager finally got around to sending the official warning letter to Deke Slayton. When Deke's wife received the letter in the mail and read its contents, she was utterly baffled. What this airport was claiming Deke did was not just unlikely, it was literally impossible. It turned out there was no way Deke Slayton could have been flying his Stinger over the skies of California that morning. First of all, the storage location that held Deke's plane was a museum in Nevada. He had donated the Stinger to them 3 years earlier, and it hadn't moved an inch since. And to make it absolutely clear, the museum had removed the engine from the plane and then hung the entire aircraft from the rafters as a display piece. The plane wasn't just in storage, it was a non-flyable artifact. But even beyond the logistical impossibility of getting the plane out of a museum and reinstalling its engine, there was a far bigger, more absolute reason that it couldn't have been Deke flying that plane. It was truly impossible, because 5 full hours before that flight was reported over Southern California, Deke Slayton had passed away peacefully in his sleep. No one has ever been able to explain what dozens of people saw in the skies that morning. Multiple eyewitnesses and sensitive electronic equipment all confirmed that a red Stinger with Deke Slayton's tail number was there. It just doesn't make any sense. Today, that official warning letter sent by the John Wayne Airport sits on display at the Deke Slayton Memorial Space Museum, a permanent tribute to a hero's final mysterious flight. One morning in June of 1972, a hospital administrator named Harold Michaels ran down the main hallway of the Almaden Hospital in California. He was completely out of breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted as fast as his legs could carry him. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with a gurney being pushed by an orderly, but he didn't even slow down to apologize. He just kept running, his mind fixed on a single goal, until he burst through the doors of the hospital cafeteria. All the nurses and doctors were inside, eating breakfast and drinking coffee before the start of their morning shifts. As soon as he was through the doors, totally winded, Harold yelled out for everyone to pay attention that he had a very important announcement to make. Immediately, the chatter in the room died down. The clinking of silverware stopped. The room went silent. Every doctor, every nurse, every staff member turned to look at him, wondering what was going on. Harold, trying to catch his breath, managed to get out one sentence. The hospital needs to update its disaster plan. He paused for a moment, letting the information sink in, and as he scanned the room, he saw looks of total confusion on nearly everyone's face. Harold understood why they would react that way. On the surface, there was no clear reason for him to be barging in and making such a frantic demand. There hadn't been any recent earthquakes or major accidents or any kind of event that would prompt such urgency. It was just a normal Tuesday morning at the hospital. Yet, here was their boss, acting like a catastrophe was imminent. There was an awkward moment of silence, a feeling of, is he serious, hanging in the air. Before anyone could really ask any questions, Harold cut them off. He just said, look, I want to make sure we are capable of handling a mass casualty event, a major emergency. We need to have a better plan in place in case something really terrible happens. We cannot be caught flat-footed. Again, there was a pause as the staff looked back at him, still trying to understand what was prompting all this. Finally, someone in the back raised their hand and simply asked, why? But Harold wasn't in the mood for a discussion. He just said, stop. Stop everything you're doing right now. Put your breakfast away. I don't care what you think. Go and update the disaster plan. Now. 8 months later, on the morning of the 7th of February 1973, Harold sat around a conference table with the other members of the hospital's newly formed disaster committee. They had been holding meetings every single month since that strange morning in the cafeteria, working tirelessly to update the hospital's emergency procedures. Just 2 days earlier, at an all-staff meeting, they had finally unveiled the brand new, comprehensive disaster plan that Harold had so frantically demanded. Every single employee at the hospital had been briefed on the new procedures, and a full-scale drill was scheduled for the very next morning to practice what to do in a major emergency. Harold should have felt relieved, knowing that they were now officially prepared, or at least far more prepared than they had been before. But as the meeting wrapped up, all Harold could focus on was a nameless feeling of dread that had been sitting in the pit of his stomach for months. After work that day, he drove home, ate dinner with his wife, and tried to relax, but he just couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. Fast forward to about 8:30 that same night. Harold was running out of his house, leaping into his car, and driving as fast as he could back to the hospital. He had just received a phone call telling him he needed to come back immediately. When he got to the hospital, the scene was one of controlled chaos. There was a line of police cars directing traffic away from the entrance, and dozens of EMTs and firefighters were rushing bleeding patients into the building on stretchers. When Harold made it inside, the emergency room was a hive of activity. Nurses were rolling gurneys down the halls, prepping extra beds in every available space, and carrying large boxes of blood packs that had just arrived from the local blood bank. Harold counted at least 6 full surgical teams already scrubbed in and standing by, ready to go before the bulk of the patients had even arrived. At this point, a head nurse grabbed Harold's arm and told him that the hospital's phone lines had gone down about 30 minutes ago. But incredibly, more than 100 off-duty doctors, nurses, and other staff members had shown up on their own, without even waiting to be officially called in. They had heard the news and came running. And when they arrived, they went straight to their assigned stations and knew exactly what to do because every single one of them had been preparing for the big disaster drill that was supposed to happen the next morning. As Harold stood there taking in the scene, he watched as EMTs wheeled in a man with third-degree burns all over his body. Instantly, a team of doctors swooped in and guided him into a trauma room. The rest of the doctors waited in an orderly line, ready to take the next patient and the next as soon as they came through the doors. Harold couldn't help but feel both deeply vindicated and incredibly spooked, because this was all happening exactly as he somehow knew it would. It would turn out that on that morning, 8 months earlier, when Harold had bolted into the cafeteria, he had just woken up from an incredibly lucid, vivid dream. It was perhaps the most vivid dream he had ever had in his entire life. In the dream, a huge plane had crashed into the middle of the city, leaving hundreds of people dead and horribly injured. And in his dream, it was his hospital, Almaden Hospital, that was tasked with saving them, and they were failing because they weren't prepared. The dream had felt so real, so much like a premonition, that it had sent him into a panic. That was why he had been so insistent on updating the emergency plan. He felt that if a plane crash like the one in his dream really happened, they wouldn't have the capacity to handle it. And so, they had to get ready right now. And on the 7th of February, 1973, literally just hours before Harold's Hospital was scheduled to conduct its first drill of the new disaster plan, a Navy jet lost control and smashed into a 4-story apartment building in the middle of the city. But because of Harold's dream, which had prompted him to force his hospital to prepare for the unthinkable, his entire staff was ready when the unthinkable happened. Initial estimates from first responders at the crash scene predicted that at least 50 people would die from their injuries. But thanks to Harold's staff and their new, well-rehearsed disaster plan, only 11 people actually did. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. 5 popular stories about people who accidentally entered dangerous situations and realized it are in this video. We completely re-edited these 5 fan favorites for today's show. Even if you've seen or heard them, this is new. You're in the right place for bizarre, dark, and mysterious stories. Weekly uploads of 2, 3, or 4. Visit the like button's house, kick the door, and leave without reason. Don't miss our weekly uploads, subscribe, and enable notifications. Start stories today. Water has always fascinated Jacob Cockle. Born in Penzance, UK, he surfed their beaches. At 10, surfing called him to skip school, frequently in trouble with parents and teachers. His ocean obsession was inexplicable. Although they disagreed, Grace, his older sister, supported and understood him. They bonded more than siblings. The besties. They even invented a language of sounds and private jokes no one could understand. Due to his frequent use, non-family thought Jacob had a speech impairment. Grace knew him well, depended on her. At 17, Jacob's world changed. Grace died quickly from brain tumor. The loss devastated Jacob. He believed his worldview shifted overnight. Though sad, he thought Grace's joy had transferred to him. To live for them and experience everything drove him. Jacob risked tons. Though risky, he couldn't miss out. Despite the risk, he wanted to live. Jacob liked water and photography. With his newfound risk-taking attitude, he filmed himself doing amazing water stunts. His stunts included surfing in massive storms, jumping off buildings into shallow water, and diving to deadly depths on one breath. Jacob liked. He liked danger, thrills, and filming. Picked this career. He became famous for risky film and photography. Jacob hung this large paper in his bedroom. He said, "I will become a world-famous photographer, and I will let nothing stand in my way." He would do anything to get his photos. Intense dedication worked. In his 20s, he won National Geographic and Sunday Times. He appeared on surf magazine covers. His prize-winning photos show the sea at its wildest. A small fishing boat returning to port was battered by a huge swell. This contest-winning shot was shown to millions on the London Underground. He shot well off Sumatra again. A huge supertanker hit him and his friend on a small ocean boat. Friends rode the supertanker's massive wake. It won a Guardian Prize despite danger. Jacob bought camera gear with competition money. Always wanted a better camera or lens. His friends would get new TVs if he won. Jacob lived fully and filmed his risks. He always wanted to photograph a bizarre encounter in Penzance, his hometown. He saw a terrifying vortex several times a year at a bay near his childhood home. A novel engineering solution prevented harbor silting. High tide flooded this massive concrete quay wall. The tunnel below this wall led to another pool. Low tide flooded that pool, draining the main harbor. The tunnel slowly filtered second pool water, cleaning the port of silt and sand. At high tide, water entered the harbor and hit the quay wall. It drained too slowly into the pool through the tunnel. A small whirlpool forms when water is sucked down the drain, like in a full bathtub. This quay wall is bigger. Water being forced down and drawn into this conduit created a huge, violent vortex visible from the quay wall. It was dangerous despite this twice-yearly whirlpool. Stay out of the water signs lined the waterfront and quay wall. Jacob ignored signs in his mid-20s. He entered whirlpools whenever they formed. He could spin outside. He posted inside and top footage on YouTube. Predicted millions of views. They were powerful and evil. Jacob, 28, saw the whirlpool near his hometown on the 28th of May, 2013. Again, he filmed inside. He rushed to his friend David's house and shouted, "Hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool." Jacob was already swirling when David got to the quay wall. Rubber horse mask on Jacob. David asked Jacob why, and Jacob said YouTube would look better. Despite the chaos, David filmed Jacob neighing in his horse mask from over the wall. Jacob stopped and swam away. Even with flippers, Jacob struggled to escape the whirlpool. He was upbeat. He told David he jumped into the whirlpool, scared. He called this quay wall the strongest he had seen. David replied, "Yeah, I can tell from up here that one's really strong." David and Jacob laughed for 18 minutes about the whirlpool's power. The vortex would release Jacob without his mask. Jacob shouted to David that he only wanted to do one more thing at the end of the video. His goal was to film the whirlpool from below. David was asked to give up his camera. When David gave Jacob his camera, he adjusted it on the surface. He inhaled and filmed underwater. On the wall, David saw Jacob dip. He noticed Jacob's behavior. Jacob swam and breathed well. David worried when Jacob didn't return after 2 minutes. Exclaimed his name. David ran across the wharf when Jacob didn't rise. The pool was filling when he looked over the railing, but Jacob was gone. He panicked and ran. He saw Jacob below after searching the water for his partner at the poolside. He was face down in the water. David rushed to wade out too late. Jacob drowns. The investigation found tragic physics. Wetsuit buoyancy let Jacob spin above this storm without falling. As you descend, water pressure compresses wetsuit air bubbles. Reduce a wetsuit buoyancy. Jacob entered this maelstrom, but his suit's strain caused him to lose buoyancy and get caught in its powerful current. He sank slowly, but persistently. He failed to flee despite his best efforts. Forced into quay wall tunnel. A stuck man drowned and was spit out the other side. The next story involves someone pursuing their passion without knowing it will end tragically. Carrie O'Connor loved learning since childhood. Beginning readers had to be persuaded to put down their books and play outside. She loved facts and stories. Carrie wanted to know everything, but French culture was her favorite. She devoured French art, history, and food. She started learning French in middle school and was nearly proficient by high school and attending college. Carrie holds several French degrees, including a PhD. Passion ruled her life. Her PhD earned her a full-time professorship at Boston University in 2019. She eagerly accepted the job. After her first year at BU, she moved closer to campus to reduce her commute and get involved. After her 38th birthday in August 2020, Carrie and her 2 cats moved into a historic apartment building on a busy street 10 minutes from Boston University. Carrie enthusiastically emailed her prospective students on her laptop while her new apartment was full of boxes and plastic-wrapped furniture. She sent the joy of learning French. Her students knew she liked French and was excited for the year. A few weeks after classes, Carrie returned to her apartment on September 14. She was excited to move her new furniture into her apartment. No assembly was done on this furniture. The instructions and pieces were in this long, heavy box that was 7 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and under 80 pounds. Carrie carried this huge parcel through her apartment building's front doors into the first-floor lobby from her car at street level. She called the elevator while leaning against the wall. Learn how Carrie's old elevator worked to understand what happens next. Manual model old. After the elevator car arrived on your floor, you slid open the huge hoistway door. The elevator truck has a side door. Automobile gate door. Slide the metal accordion door manually. The elevator needed the vehicle gate closed, unlike the hoistway door, to move between floors. After the first floor lobby light rang, Carrie opened the hoistway door to the elevator. From inside, she opened the auto gate. She tried to force her parcel into the lift. Standing at an angle was her only chance to fit this huge bundle in the elevator. She tried hard, but failed. Carrie was doing this when another renter entered the apartment building's front doors. He ignored Carrie's boxing match and went upstairs to his apartment. Stopped and turned. Carrie added, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy for that elevator. The elevator's really old and you might trip a sensor. It might start moving before you're ready. You know, we've had problems with that elevator before. It's just not worth the risk." Carrie stopped to look at her package, determined to continue. Carrie looked at the guy and said, "You know what? I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." The other tenant hesitated again and said, "Okay, I'll help her do it." He held open the heavy hoistway door while Carrie went inside. She hip-opened the accordion vehicle gate. This parcel was angled into the elevator car after much pushing and shoving. "No problem," he said after Carrie thanked him and left up the stairs. Carrie didn't press the floor buttons after leaving. She attempted to protect her package with the car gate. Basement maintenance worker hailed elevator also. While inside, Carrie didn't notice her large item's top hit a door frame safety sensor. Car gates close sensors. The maintenance man pressed the call button because that package was pressing on the sensor, fooling the elevator system into thinking the gate had closed and it was time to leave. The car fell. The package slipped off the sensor after a few feet, stopping the lift. Carrie likely wondered how this car moved with the gate open. Her problems worsened. She got stuck in the first-floor lobby basement elevator. She stayed calm. She returned her box to the lift before deciding. The item fell forward and protruded from the elevator after leaving that sensor. Upper half faced first-floor lobby. Carrie stooped with her back to the lift under her bundle. Pushing the box with her shoulder, returned it to the car. The package top again touched the gate shut sensor. The elevator lowered again, feeling safe. Carrie lost balance and fell backwards into the tiny space between the elevator and shaft with her back to the opening. Probably could have crawled up the elevator, if still. This time, she didn't remove her package from the sensor. The lift kept going down, thinking the gate was closed. Carrie would have been crushed against the shaft wall as the car drove past her toward the basement due to the elevator's downward speed. But the car never reached the basement. Carrie was perfectly trapped between the elevator and shaft walls when it stopped. Too late, firefighters arrived. Carrie died. Not bad mechanics, but seemingly safe environments can be deadly. In 1900, one 8-year-old Thomas Pedler told his mother he was going out but would return for turkey that afternoon. He left with his coat and jacket. Thomas lived in a dull San Francisco working-class neighborhood. The workplace was for work only. Thomas's neighborhood had a big event today. The Stanford-UC football game in Thomas's area was expected to draw over 20,000 fans. Thomas wanted to see this great event, but couldn't afford tickets. He planned to watch this game. Thomas ran to the nearby stadium and waited at the entrance. Thomas's friend Charles went to the front gate at 11 a.m. Two met and tried to enter the stadium with the crowd. However, the stadium was packed hours before the big game's 2:30 kickoff. Chairs and stands were absent. People wondered where to watch the game. Thomas and Charles asked, "What's the point of sneaking in if nobody's watching?" So they watched the game elsewhere. While looking around, they saw a huge stadium barrier. This barrier was jumped to see the land below. Thomas and Charles found all the best fencing spots taken when they tested it. Open positions have no field view. Some other failed option. Thomas and Charles were annoyed. They feared missing the big game. After returning to the stadium's front gates, they saw a crowd running to a large white brick factory across the street. They scaled this building with ladders. They free-climbed windows and fire escapes to reach the top of this 5-story building. Thomas and Charles could see the field from the factory's flat roof. Many sought good game seats. Thomas and Charles readily agreed. After exiting the stadium, they ran across the street and climbed ladders to climb windows and fire escapes to reach the roof 55 feet above ground. Few people were at the summit. After running to the front, Thomas and Charles saw the game well. When the game started at 2:30, Thomas and Charles's rooftop was full after 2 hours. Hundreds scaled this factory. Factory workers shouted to workers below to stop because it was unsafe. They were ignored, or the police ignored it. A crowd gathered on this roof. Play began with many excited players. As the game began at 2:30, the rooftop herd stadium crowd grew. Several bands performed at the stadium. The chaos below energized the roof. Thomas, Charles, and others loved this game. Chanting, screaming, yelling. Charles and Thomas liked chaos. 20 minutes into the game, Thomas and Charles were having fun, and the audience was going crazy when one roof side cracked. Thomas and Charles looked back to see where the cracking sound came from and saw people trying to get off the roof across the sea of people. The floor beneath Thomas, Charles, and everyone else fell before they could figure out what was happening due to a stronger cracking sound. Roofers plummeted 55 feet to industrial. Few floors in this factory. Instead, a 5-foot high open building housed this large brick building in the factory center. About as tall as the factory. It looked like a shell with a 40-foot brick building in the middle. Thomas fell after the ceiling collapsed, but he grabbed a factory beam to stop. Thomas survived a 5-foot fall. He struggled with this beam. His grip was weak. Thomas looked down to observe. Helpers shouted and ran to the fallen. Thomas found Charles easily. Another lucky guy was Charles. Thomas thought Charles and 15-20 others were lucky to land on the factory's brick structure instead of the roof. Charlie fell 10 to 15 feet onto this structure. Thomas added, "Oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall. They're okay." Charles and the others who were saved by landing on this brick structure let out primal, blood-curdling cries after hitting it, despite having no broken bones or internal injuries. This made loud popping sounds from their bodies. Bug-like, they advanced. This factory was odd. Glassmaking requires high temperatures for sand and chemicals. Need lava-hot furnace. The brick building in the middle of this 5-story facility had a glass furnace. Even though the inside of this furnace was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside, where Charles and the others landed thinking they were saved from a 55-foot fall, was scorching. Even with protective gear, the furnace was too hot for industrial workers. This furnace used long metal pokers, remote-controlled glass, and flames. After landing on this furnace, Charles and others burned. Their bodies snapped to life. So Thomas and the others who survived this terrible collapse watched Charles and the others cry, contort, burn, and smolder. Charles's tightly curled body rolled down the furnace's slope. In a furnace crack, he fell into flames and went silent. After Charles and others stopped shrieking, roadside spectators entered. One was Thomas's dad. Unfortunately, he saw his son Thomas on the beam. This plant was so hot that Thomas sweated and lost his beam grip. Thomas lost his grip and fell 10 more feet against the furnace as his father watched. He fell feet first, hitting his stomach and face. Burned, shouted, and fell silent. This roof collapse killed 23, wounded, and disfigured many. A worst sports fall ever. On this day, the stadium crowd was too focused on the game to notice the 100-foot disaster. After the game, the winning team's fans paraded their players out of the stadium to celebrate seeing these charred, rolled-up furnace victims. Next, a family took one wrong turn and realized every choice could be fatal. Oregon French major Katie Fleming was 21 inches 1,996. She camped with friends and strangers that summer. The Sierra Nevada in California was stunning. Katie disliked the surroundings after arriving. Instead, she focused on trip stranger James Kim, 25. People believed James and Katie fell in love immediately on this vacation. They were together during the trip. After this vacation, James and Katie moved from Seattle to Oregon. After Katie graduated college, they married in Las Vegas and moved to San Francisco. A software company hired James to test new technology and provide user reviews. Technology was always his thing. James likes his job because he plays with toys for money. They opened 2 San Francisco stores, Apothecary and Strange Clothing Store. Katie runs both shops full-time. Kim's were rich and large by 2006. These girls were Penelope, 4, and Sabine, 7 months. Katie loved their kids, but James was known for disregarding everyone for his girls. Friends and family reported James couldn't be talked to if his children were around because he'd get distracted and stare at them, then leave mid-conversation to play. Even though it was illegal, James brought his girls to work almost every day. James, Katie, and their 2 daughters drove north to Seattle in their station wagon on November 17th. Holiday preparations included Thanksgiving with James's city aunt and uncle. Seattle appealed to James and Katie as they considered leaving San Francisco. We enjoyed seeing family and exploring. They arrived in Seattle late Friday night after a long flight. They spent 2 days celebrating Thanksgiving with relatives. Friday morning, November 24, James, Katie, and their girls returned to the station wagon after Thanksgiving. They left James's aunt and uncle to drive. Instead of going to San Francisco, which would have taken all day, they stopped in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's close college friends was due to meet them for lunch. After 3 or 4 hours, they reached Portland, met Katie's friend, and had lunch. The family stayed in a motel. The intention was to drive back to San Francisco the next morning. Katie recommended to James that we stay here for part of the day, depart in the afternoon, and stop someplace between here and home instead of traveling all day. Break the drive again? The concept impressed James. Katie identified a family-friendly vacation destination roughly midway between home and home on the map. Tutu Tun Lodge was at Gold Beach, Oregon. James and Katie thought, perfect. This is exactly what we needed. Katie booked a lodge night. After enjoying Portland, the family went south to the lodge that afternoon. At 8:35 p.m., James remarked, "Let's pull over and get a bite to eat." The family parked at a Central Oregon Denny's. They dined indoors and left at 9. Drive time from Denny's to lodging was 2.5 hours. 2 hours later, James discovered they missed a turn. So he told Katie. They reviewed the map and determined that turning back would take several hours. Found an alternative after searching. The goal was to proceed west to the ocean and then south to this lodge, but they might go south until they were parallel to it, then cut west along Bear Camp Road. It would go there. The map did not show Bear Camp Road's risk. Before reaching Gold Beach and this lodge, it soared from 900 to 4,000 feet on the mountain's flank. The mountainside cut paved road is tiny. Steep drop-offs without guardrails dominate this ride. Please utilize Bear Camp Road only in summer due to maintenance. Due to lack of maintenance, even a light snowstorm can make the road impassable in winter. The route runs through a sparsely populated Oregon region. Anyone who gets into problems outside is probably alone. This route was treacherous, but Kim's didn't know. After traveling south, they took Bear Camp Road and gently climbed the mountain. It started to snow as Katie fell asleep in the passenger seat and the girls in the back while James drove. An hour later, Katie woke asleep to see James's windshield wipers on full blast and barely visible through the front windshield. My husband was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, staring out the window. She asked, "What's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around?" James replied, "Yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't." He told his wife that they had driven through a fork in the road and were hoping for another. Katie hesitated, but trusted James and said, "Okay, let's keep going." James drove up the mountain pass. Driving on a cliff. Snow slickened the road left of James, which dropped sharply. James was on a cliff, and his car slipped and slid at 5 miles per hour. After several more stressful miles, they reached no turnaround. Indeed, they would have to stop on inclines, apply the emergency brake, and have one clear branches and rocks from this tiny road to continue. Katie said, "You have to stop. You have to back out of here. That's our only choice right now." James reversed and opened his car door to check for falls off the cliff. So he slowly reversed without gas to avoid falling off the cliff. This lasted hours. Must have been stressful. At that fork in the road James had seen earlier, they decided they had two options. Turn around and drive nose out along the previous path to return to the highway. After a long drive, they knew the road was treacherous, had a cliff drop-off, and was as dangerous as before. Weather prevented them from taking that road. They could descend the mountain wider by turning left. The road looked like a huge, straight descent. They said, "We don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear." But you have to figure, if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses or a gas station or something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going the other way. James turned onto this new road. Their worst decision. Loggers used this winding dead-end road in summer. A big yellow gate was supposed to block all traffic past this fork, catching the Kim family's mistake. This gate was cut, opened, and locked by vandals recently. The gate was completely off-road. No gate was visible as the Kims drove past where they would have been stopped. No gate existed, so they drove. The road narrowed and became dirt and potholes after this gate. The couple drove 15 miles on this narrow, winding cliffside road until they reached another fork where they could go right or straight. No signs guided. James and Katie looked at each other after stopping at the intersection. They anticipated issues. No service on our phones when we called for help. One noticed no snow while calling. Rain melted much of the snow. After several minutes without calls, they decided, you know what? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're tired. Let's sleep here. We'll leave the car running. It'll be nice and warm. And when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. They were relieved to find they were fine. James, Katie, and their daughters slept in their car. It was comfy. But Katie and James woke up to worse conditions. After bedtime, the rain became heavy snow. Over the frozen groundwater, almost a foot of snow fell. They stayed. Katie and James didn't panic because they saw a plow truck off Bear Camp Road when they turned. Bear Camp Road was expected snowplowed. Kim's drove all day. Reed snacked and kept the heater on while waiting for rescue. No one drove that road all day. Nobody tilts. Katie and James repeatedly called for help but got no response. They honked the horn in case anyone heard, but no one helped. James and Katie worried after Sunday night. Their babies were 4 and 7 months. They couldn't last. You know what? It's Sunday. Maybe the plows don't come through. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. Plows will arrive on Monday. They'll save. Katie said, "Hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence, and they will report it to police, and they will come out here and save us. We'll be back tomorrow." The family fell asleep after Katie and James buckled their daughters in car seats, and James read bedtime stories. Monday saw the family repeating many actions. They stayed positive in their car. Cell phones failed. Honking was ignored. They ate less and watched for roadside plows. No trucks, plows, or anything traveled this road all day. A San Francisco family friend noticed the Kim family's absence, but they didn't report it to police because they thought they were just staying out longer and would return soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were scared. They nearly ran out of gas. Food was scarce. Katie breastfed her 7-month-old and 4-year-old to compensate for low food intake. Bears inspected their car from the outside. Katie and James failed to scare the bears away by screaming. While not confrontational, the family felt awkward leaving their car. These small cars' snow-covered windows trapped them. They ran out of supplies and couldn't call or leave. The situation was bad. Katie and James were tough until now, but they and their kids started acting scared. Parents reassured them they would be fine and leave soon. Katie and James knew they would die if not found soon. No cars or trucks traveled either road Tuesday morning. There was snow, plows, and food shortages. Due to their abundance, James left the car to search for bear droppings. Their droppings berries were eaten by him and Katie. For fear of poisoning themselves, they decided against it. Fear and anxiety drove their daughter's actions the day before. Very quiet and lazy. After this, the parents fought over blame but were afraid of what might happen. No one reported the family to San Francisco police. The Kims huddled again Tuesday night in their car. All the kids fell asleep after James read. Next Wednesday morning, their car ran out of gas. No heat source. James warmed the family with the spare tire from the back of the car, magazines, and fire. The fire died out, and they couldn't find dry wood to put on it. There was no fire soon. James and Katie waited all day for a car or truck up the road. Never did. The James and Katie phones never worked after multiple attempts. They honked and yelled for help, but were ignored. It got dark again as the family huddled in their cold car, hearing only bears prowling. James and Katie probably thought, I wonder if we'll survive the night. After seeing the Kims missing on Monday, a family friend in San Francisco reported them missing to the police on Wednesday afternoon. A search party was organized that night, but Kim family was unaware. Thursday morning for the Kims. James and Katie warned of death after the night. Katie asked, You have to promise me, if our 2 kids die out here, you have to kill me too. James agreed. Katie and James thought no truck, car, or anything could save them on this route. It seemed their only option was to smoke signal a pilot. They removed their 4-car tires and put flammables on them. Stuffed lamb was Penelope's prized possession. They burned their massive pile. A huge black smoke cloud appeared. The Kims hoped to be seen in the smoke. Sadly, the fire spread quickly. No planes flew over, so it couldn't be lit. That night, the family was trapped in their freezing car again. Kids weren't screaming, bears prowled outside, and they were almost out of food. They were sad, silent, and cold. James feared his family would die from shivering and struggling to stay warm, so he acted quickly. The next morning, Friday, James told Katie that he had studied the map and found Gallus 4 miles east that he could reach in 2 hours. Katie shouted, No, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found. James knew no one would find them in time, so he had to get help. Katie reluctantly let him go because he seemed confident. James hugged and kissed his daughters at 7:45 a.m., saying he loved and would see them soon. He hugged his wife, said he loved her, and left. The Kims were unaware that hundreds of rescuers and helicopters were searching Bear Camp Road. On Sunday, December 3, a week after the family got stuck, a search helicopter pilot saw snow tracks near Bear Camp Road. He followed the tracks. He couldn't hear the footsteps under the trees. Due to fuel shortages, he followed the footprints back to their source. These footprints led him to a clearing with an automobile in the middle after a long time. Katie held up an umbrella by the car. The pilot saw her immediately, but lacked fuel to land and rescue her family. Instead, he swooped down as low as possible, looked at her, and said, "I see you, and we're coming for you." He then marked their location on the map. He flew to search headquarters, where another helicopter launched minutes later. They flew there and landed in the clearing. Once he exited, the pilot saw Katie run toward him with her two healthy daughters. She cried joyous tears and thanked him. "You know, are you here because of my husband?" "Did James tell you where we were?" she asked him. Pilot looked confused. Katie commented that James had left for Gallus for help 2 days earlier and hadn't returned. Our story begins earlier that afternoon inside Riverside Park in Chester-le-Street, England. Elizabeth Collings was spending the day with her 4-year-old grandson, enjoying what should have been a completely ordinary summer afternoon. The weather was beautiful. Families relaxed across the grass, while children played beneath the sunlight and a warm breeze drifted through the trees. Then her grandson suddenly pointed across the park. Towering above the field was a massive, glowing structure pulsing with color and music. Long lines of people waited outside its entrance. Curious, Elizabeth and her grandson decided to go inside. Less than 10 minutes later, Elizabeth realized her feet were no longer touching the ground. For most people who knew Elizabeth Collings, she was exactly the kind of person you would expect to see quietly enjoying a summer afternoon in the park. She was 68 years old, lived locally in the area, and was known by friends and family as kind, calm, and deeply devoted to the people around her. She especially loved spending time with her grandchildren, and that afternoon with her grandson had not been planned as anything unusual or exciting. They had simply decided to enjoy the weather together. At the exact same time, however, only a short distance away, another person was dealing with an entirely different kind of emotion: anxiety, pressure, fear that years of work were about to collapse in front of him. That man was Maurice Agus. Maurice was 74 years old and had spent nearly 4 decades building large-scale immersive art installations around the world. His work was strange, ambitious, and designed to emotionally overwhelm the people who experienced it. He did not create ordinary sculptures or paintings. Instead, Maurice built environments people could physically walk through, glowing, dreamlike spaces filled with light, color, and sound, meant to make visitors feel transported into another reality. And Dreamspace was supposed to be the greatest thing he had ever created. To Maurice, Dreamspace was not just another project. It was supposed to be the exclamation point at the end of his career. The structure itself was enormous, stretching nearly half the size of a football field. It consisted of giant inflatable chambers made from thin, colorful plastic material connected together like a maze. Inside were winding rooms illuminated by shifting colored lights, while ambient music echoed softly through hidden speakers. The goal was to create feelings of peace, calmness, and emotional wonder. Visitors were meant to slowly wander from room to room, almost forgetting where they were. Maurice believed Dreamspace would become one of the defining works of his life. But on the morning of July 23rd, the opening of the exhibit immediately began going wrong. When Maurice and his team arrived at Riverside Park early that morning, they discovered several construction issues still had not been completed. Some sections of the inflatable walls were not positioned correctly. Certain support systems still needed adjustment. More importantly, several of the heavy-duty anchor ropes designed to secure the structure safely to the ground had not yet been fully installed. Under normal circumstances, Maurice likely would have delayed opening until everything was finished. The problem was that visitors had already begun arriving at the park. As the morning continued, the line outside Dreamspace became larger and larger. Maurice watched as crowds formed near the entrance. Some people checked their watches impatiently, while others asked staff members when the exhibit would finally open. Maurice became increasingly nervous. After spending years preparing Dreamspace, the thought of people leaving before experiencing it terrified him. He worried that if the opening failed, then the final masterpiece of his career would become an embarrassment instead. For hours, Maurice and his staff rushed around trying to finish repairs and adjustments as quickly as possible. But eventually, Maurice reached a point where he felt trapped between two bad options. Either continue delaying the opening and risk visitors walking away, or open the exhibit before every final safety precaution had been completed. And so Maurice made the decision investigators would later focus on again and again. He stepped back, looked over the work his team had completed, and convinced himself everything was probably safe enough. Not perfect, but good enough. He instructed his staff to stop what they were doing and begin letting people inside. At first, the decision seemed completely justified. Dreamspace was an immediate success. Visitors emerged from the structure, smiling and amazed by what they had seen inside. More and more people joined the line throughout the afternoon. Some described the exhibit as magical, while others said it felt like walking through a dream. Standing outside the structure, Maurice finally began to relax for the first time all day. Maybe the stress and rushing had all been worth it after all. Including Elizabeth and her grandson, visitors entering Dreamspace that afternoon had absolutely no idea that parts of the structure surrounding them had not been fully secured. The moment Elizabeth Collins stepped inside Dreamspace, she immediately understood why everyone outside seemed so excited. The interior looked unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The lighting inside was dim and soft, with glowing walls shifting between shades of blue, green, purple, and orange. Gentle ambient music echoed through the inflatable chambers while visitors quietly wandered from room to room. Even though the structure was crowded and warm, the atmosphere somehow still felt peaceful. People instinctively lowered their voices as they moved through the glowing corridor. Elizabeth smiled at her grandson and quietly told him it was beautiful inside. For the next several minutes, the two slowly explored the maze together. They passed through chambers glowing with deep blue light before entering others illuminated with warm amber colors. In certain areas, the colors blended together in strange ways that made the walls appear almost alive. Combined with the music and the shifting light, the entire experience felt strangely hypnotic. Eventually, Elizabeth and her grandson entered one particular room, illuminated almost entirely in blue. Nearby, another chamber cast orange light through one of the openings, creating a greenish glow where the colors overlapped. The ambient music hummed softly around them while visitors stood quietly admiring the atmosphere. And for a few brief moments, Elizabeth completely forgot she was standing inside a giant inflatable structure in the middle of a public park. Then, suddenly, a violent snapping sound exploded through the exhibit. It was unbelievably loud, like a giant rope being torn apart. The entire room jolted sideways. Several people stumbled into the walls, while others instinctively grabbed onto nearby surfaces to steady themselves. Elizabeth felt dizzy as the glowing room around her tilted unnaturally. At first, many visitors assumed part of the structure had collapsed. But then something happened that made no sense at all. Elizabeth felt her body suddenly become weightless. Her feet were no longer touching the floor. Outside Dreamspace, people across Riverside Park turned toward the structure in confusion. Witnesses later said the enormous inflatable exhibit appeared to rise into the air almost slowly at first, like a giant balloon being lifted upward. Then the wind caught it. The entire structure twisted violently above the park while screams erupted from inside. Standing near the entrance, Maurice August heard the snapping sound and immediately turned around. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dreamspace was floating into the sky with dozens of people trapped inside. The structure rose nearly 30 feet above the ground as terrified visitors were thrown violently against the inflatable walls. Inside, people screamed and clawed desperately for balance as the chambers twisted and folded in the wind. Some visitors slammed into each other, while others tried desperately to hold on to the plastic walls around them. Then, openings began appearing in the structure. And suddenly, people started falling out. Witnesses across the park watched in horror as human bodies dropped from the sky and crashed onto the grass below. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Some people screamed, while others froze in complete shock, staring upward at the floating structure. Even after people began falling from dream space, the ambient music inside the exhibit could still faintly be heard drifting across the park, creating a surreal contrast against the chaos unfolding below. Eventually, the structure collapsed back down onto the grass, but by then, the damage had already been done. Emergency crews rushed into Riverside Park within minutes and found scenes of complete devastation. Injured victims were scattered across the field, while pieces of the collapsed inflatable structure covered the grass. Some people had broken bones, while others were unconscious. Witnesses stood crying or staring silently at the wreckage, struggling to process what they had just seen. In total, 27 people were injured. 2 people died. One of them was Elizabeth Collins. In the immediate aftermath, many people assumed the disaster had simply been caused by an unexpected gust of wind. Because dream space was inflatable, that explanation initially seemed reasonable, but investigators quickly began finding evidence that made the situation far more disturbing. Weather reports from that afternoon showed only mild winds moving through the area, nothing remotely strong enough to launch such a massive structure into the air. That detail immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Authorities began carefully examining the remains of dream space, focusing especially on the anchoring systems designed to secure the structure safely to the ground. And then investigators discovered the critical detail that explained everything. The front anchor ropes securing dream space had been installed properly, but several rear anchor points had never been attached at all. That discovery completely destroyed the original theory that the disaster had been unavoidable. Investigators reconstructed the final sequence of events piece by piece. Earlier that morning, Maurice's staff had been rushing to complete preparations before visitors lost patience and left the park. The unfinished rear anchors were supposed to be secured later, but when Maurice decided to open the exhibit early, those safety measures were never completed. Because dream space was constructed from extremely lightweight inflatable material, the mild afternoon breeze moving across Riverside Park had been enough to slip underneath the unsecured rear section of the structure. Once air began lifting the inflatable chambers upward, the secured front anchors strained against the force until they finally snapped one after another. That deafening sound heard by everyone inside dream space had been the exact moment the structure tore free from the earth. Investigators concluded the disaster had been entirely preventable. If the remaining anchors had been secured properly, dream space likely never would have lifted into the air at all. And the most horrifying part was that the weather itself had never truly been dangerous. It had simply been an ordinary summer breeze interacting with an unfinished safety system. Following the investigation, Maurice Agis was convicted of violating health and safety regulations and received a financial penalty. But by then, the legal consequences barely mattered compared to the emotional devastation surrounding the tragedy. Dream space had been intended to create peace, wonder, and serenity. Instead, it became permanently associated with death. Maurice was reportedly destroyed emotionally by what had happened. The exhibit he believed would define his legacy had instead become remembered as one of the deadliest art installation disasters in modern British history. He never created another major installation again. 3 years later, in 2009, Maurice died. For the survivors and witnesses who were there that afternoon, the tragedy inside Riverside Park never truly ended when the wreckage of dream space was finally cleared away. Years later, many people still spoke about the same horrifying image they could not erase from their minds, a giant, colorful structure silently drifting into the summer sky, while terrified people fell from inside it. Some witnesses later admitted they avoided returning to the park entirely because simply seeing the open field brought back memories of the screams, the panic, and the bodies hitting the ground. For the families of the victims, especially the family of Elizabeth Collins, the pain was even harder to process because the day had begun so normally. Elizabeth had not traveled somewhere dangerous. She had not knowingly taken a risk. She had simply gone for a peaceful walk with her grandson on a warm summer afternoon. The disaster also left a permanent shadow over the legacy of Maurice Agis. Dream space had been created to inspire feelings of peace, wonder, and serenity. Instead, it became remembered as a symbol of how one rushed decision can destroy lives in seconds. Although Maurice was fined for violating health and safety regulations, many people believed the emotional punishment that followed was far greater. Reports said he was devastated by the tragedy and never created another major installation again. The masterpiece he hoped would define his 40-year career instead became forever connected to death and trauma. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story is how ordinary everything looked right before the disaster happened. Families laughing in the park, music drifting through the summer air, children running across the grass. Nothing felt dangerous. Nothing felt wrong. Until suddenly, it was too late. Because sometimes the deadliest tragedies are not caused by evil intentions or violent storms. Sometimes they begin with ordinary people convincing themselves that good enough is safe enough, and once that line is crossed, there is no taking the decision back. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If this story stayed with you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy true crime, strange disasters, and mysterious real-life stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss future uploads. Until next time, see ya. On a Monday morning in February of 2003, a man living in a quiet suburb in France was at home when his phone rang. He looked down at the screen, saw the number, and recognized it as belonging to a coworker. So he answered it. But when he put the phone to his ear, he didn't hear the familiar voice of his colleague. Instead, all he heard was a strange static, and in the background, the faint, muffled sound of voices. He thought it was probably just a pocket dial, but he kept listening anyway. He put the phone on speaker so his wife, who was in the room with him, could listen in as well. Together, they leaned in close, trying to make out what was being said. And as the seconds ticked by, they were able to decipher fragments of a conversation happening between two women they didn't know. The more they listened, the more unsettling the conversation became. It was clear these two women were talking about a murder. And then, one of the women distinctly said that they needed to come up with an alibi. On the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of February, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lunet was clearing the lunch dishes from the dining table at her home in Cunha, France. Her husband Claude and two of her adult sons, Frank and Pascal, were still sitting at the table finishing their coffees. As Monique moved back and forth from the kitchen, the men discussed what they still needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were all heading to a family gathering just outside of Paris, which was about a 3.5-hour drive away. The party was to celebrate the retirement of Claude's sister-in-law. Monique, however, was not going with them. She had told everyone that someone needed to stay behind to look after their 4 dogs, and while that was certainly true, it wasn't the whole story. The real reason Monique wasn't going was because she just did not get along with her husband's side of the family. The relationship was complicated and had been for a very long time. Monique and Claude had gotten married nearly 20 years earlier. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they each brought children from their previous relationships into the new family. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. For the first few years, this big, blended family had managed to get along reasonably well. But as time went on, serious cracks began to form. Personality clashes started to arise, specifically between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude had married, all 5 of his daughters were already teenagers or in their early 20s. So, while they accepted Monique as their father's new wife, they never really saw her as a mother figure. They were already very close with their biological mother, Claude's ex-wife, a woman named Beatrice. To them, Beatrice was their mother, and Monique was just an addition to the family, not a replacement. Then, in 1993, an event occurred that completely shattered the fragile peace. One of Claude's young grandsons, the son of one of his daughters, accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him. This accusation ripped the family in two. The incident was never reported to the police, so no official investigation ever took place to determine if the claim was true. But that didn't matter to the family. Claude's 5 daughters and his ex-wife Beatrice fully believed the grandson. They were convinced Jean-Luc was guilty. On the other side, Monique staunchly defended her son, insisting he would never do such a thing. Claude was trapped in the middle, torn between his wife and his daughters. The fallout was immense and ugly. The two sides of the family stopped speaking to each other entirely for a whole year. By 2003, as they prepared for this retirement party, they were all technically on speaking terms again, but the atmosphere was always incredibly tense and uncomfortable whenever they were all in the same room. And so, that was the other, more significant reason why Monique was not going to the party. And for the same reason, her son Jean-Luc wasn't going either. Finally, around 3 o'clock that afternoon, the bags were packed. Claude and the two sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car. Monique walked them to the front door. She said her goodbyes, gave her husband a kiss, and then stood on the doorstep watching as they all climbed into the car and drove off down the street. A few hours passed. At around 6:30 in the evening, Monique heard a knock on her front door. She went to answer it, and when she opened it, she saw her son, Jean-Luc, standing on the porch holding his bicycle by the handlebars. He told his mom he was just stopping by for a quick visit on his way home from work. She smiled and told him to come on in. Jean-Luc leaned his bike against the exterior wall of the house and followed his mother inside. As he was taking off his coat in the entryway, he mentioned that her neighbor from across the street, a man named Henri, had been staring at him as he rode up. It wasn't just a casual glance. Jean-Luc said it felt like the man was spying on him. This comment unsettled Monique a bit. Henri was known in the neighborhood for being something of a loose cannon. He had a particular obsession with people parking in front of his house. Anytime someone dared to park their car on the public street in front of his property, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle. He'd been known to slash tires or pour motor oil all over the hoods of cars. The man simply did not care about consequences. Over the years, Monique and her sons had gotten into several heated arguments with Henri over parking spaces. One of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But tonight, Jean-Luc hadn't come by car, he was on his bike. So, Monique just hoped that whatever issue Henri had, it wouldn't escalate into anything. There was no car to vandalize, so hopefully, he would just leave them alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen and poured them both a glass of sparkling wine. They sat at the kitchen table and chatted for about 30 minutes, just catching up. After they finished their drinks, Monique gave Jean-Luc a quick haircut in the kitchen. Then, at around 5 minutes past 7, Jean-Luc said it was time for him to go. He needed to get back to his apartment for dinner with his wife. He said goodbye to his mom, walked outside, and was relieved to see that his bicycle was untouched. The tires hadn't been slashed. He got on his bike and rode off into the evening. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique went about her evening routine. She corralled her 4 dogs, putting them behind a baby gate that sectioned off the base of the staircase. She gave them their food and fresh water. Then she went back into the kitchen and started to prepare a simple dinner for herself. But a little while later, at around 7:30, Monique heard another knock at the front door. She knew it was very unlikely to be Jean-Luc again. As she walked down the long hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri from across the street. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling groggy and tired. She hadn't slept well at all. Throughout the night, she'd been kept awake by the sound of dogs barking incessantly somewhere in the neighborhood. She got out of bed, walked over to her bedroom window, and pulled open the blinds. As her eyes adjusted to the bright morning light, she glanced down from her second-story window into the yard of the white 2-story house next door. That was Monique's house. As she looked, she noticed something dark lying in the middle of the paved walkway that led from the sidewalk to Monique's front door. The neighbor pressed her face against the cool glass of the window and squinted, trying to get a better look. And then her heart stopped. She realized what she was seeing was not a pile of clothes or a bag of trash. It was a body lying face down on the pavement. In a rush of panic, the woman stumbled back from the window, ran out of her room, grabbed the phone from the hallway, and dialed the police. A couple of hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Ann P. pulled her car up to the curb in front of a white two-story house now cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape. A medical examiner's van was already parked out front. As Captain P. got out of her car, a uniformed officer walked over to greet her. He led her through the gate and over to where the body of a woman was lying in the front yard. The officer told the captain that the victim was Monique Loon, and she had been discovered just like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. He said that based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died sometime between 8 o'clock and midnight the night before. Captain P crouched down to get a better look at the body. But even from a distance, she could tell that the woman had suffered gruesome, horrific injuries. There was blood covering Monique's face and caked onto her clothes. Her torso appeared to have been completely shredded by what were clearly multiple stab wounds. Just by looking at the scene, Captain P guessed that this woman had been stabbed at least a dozen times, probably more. She also noticed obvious defensive wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms. The cuts and slashes on her skin told a clear story. Monique had put up a fierce fight against her killer. After a few more moments observing the body, Captain P stood back up. She asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. The officer said, no, not really, aside from the fact that Monique's 4 dogs had been barking non-stop for most of the night, starting at around 8 o'clock. Captain P nodded, taking this in. She thanked the officer and then made her way over to the front door of the house. The door was closed. She examined the frame and the handle, looking for any signs of a forced entry, but she didn't see any. What she did see was a smeared, bloody handprint on the exterior wall just to the side of the door. She carefully turned the handle, which was unlocked, and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her was chilling. The hallway just inside the entrance was absolutely covered in blood. Spatter marked the walls, and a large pool had collected on the floor. Captain P carefully stepped inside, making sure to avoid disturbing any of the blood or leaving any of her own footprint. She moved slowly down the hallway, peering into the other rooms. She saw that, for the most part, the blood spatter was contained to the entryway. This told her that the attack on Monique had likely started and ended right here, in this small space. Her initial working theory began to form. Monique must have had a visitor. Someone knocked, she opened the door, and she was attacked almost immediately. But then, as Captain P stepped back outside and onto the front porch, she looked down at the walkway again and noticed something that didn't make any sense. Despite the massive amount of blood just inside the front door, there was not a single drop of blood on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. Given the volume of blood Monique had clearly lost inside the house, Captain P seriously doubted that she would have been physically capable of running out into the yard after such a brutal attack. So she started to wonder if perhaps the body had been moved after she had died. Monique was a large woman. If her killer had been able to overpower her in a fight and then also carry or drag her body that distance after she was dead, Captain P assumed that the killer had to be quite strong. In her mind, she began to build a profile of the suspect. It was likely a big, strong man. But what she couldn't figure out was why. Why would a killer go to the trouble of dragging a corpse out into the front yard where any passing neighbor could easily see it? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique's body to be found as soon as possible. And since it seemed that Monique had willingly opened the front door to her attacker, Captain P was fairly certain that the killer was someone Monique knew. Around noon that same day, Saturday, February 8th, Captain P was about to go next door to speak with one of Monique's neighbors herself when a car suddenly pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out. They looked at the police tape and the official vehicles with expressions of complete shock and deep concern. By this point, Captain P had learned from other neighbors that Monique had a husband and several adult sons. She assumed that these 3 men must be them. She immediately hurried down the walkway to intercept them to keep them from walking into the active crime scene. The 3 men crowded around her, their voices overlapping as they asked what was going on, where was Monique, what had happened. Captain P gently told them the devastating news that Monique had been stabbed to death. At first, all 3 of them fell completely silent, stunned. Then, one of the men, one of the sons, just broke down and started to cry. Captain P explained that they couldn't go into the house yet, so instead, she led them over to the curb and they all sat down. She could see that the men were in deep shock. It seemed like their minds couldn't even process the words she had just told them. But it was critical for the investigation to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So, Captain P took out a small notepad and a pen and gently began asking them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, explained that all 3 of them had left the house around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home by herself. He told her about the family gathering near Paris they had gone to, how they had stayed overnight, and had only just gotten back into town. They saw the police presence from down the street and had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Captain P asked Claude to give her the names of everyone in their family. All the adult children from both sides, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everyone. As Claude listed the names, he insisted that he just couldn't imagine anyone in their family being involved in something like this. Captain P nodded patiently. She knew from experience that, unfortunately, family members were often involved in these kinds of cases. But she kept her thoughts to herself. Instead, she just asked, "Can you think of anyone at all who would want to hurt Monique?" Claude thought for a long moment and then shook his head. He said no, she lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then, one of the sons spoke up. He said that, actually, there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed to the house directly across the street. A minute later, Captain P was knocking on the front door of Henri's house. After a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered. He seemed very curious about all the commotion across the street. Captain P eventually told him directly that his neighbor, Monique, had been murdered, and when she said that, Henri smiled. A small but unmistakable smile. Immediately, alarm bells started ringing in Captain P's head. This man's reaction was deeply suspicious. She asked him if she could come inside and look around his house. Henri didn't seem surprised by the request at all, almost as if he was expecting to be treated as a suspect. He just said, "Sure, come on in," and stepped aside. Captain P entered the house and began a systematic search of every room, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or anything else that seemed suspicious or out of place. Eventually, she made her way back to the living room where Henri was waiting for her. She asked him where he was the previous evening. He told her very casually that he and his wife were right here, at home. To Captain P, this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with his wife later to confirm his story. Next, she asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. Henri said no, but then he paused. He said there was one thing. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. At this, Captain P's attention sharpened. The family had already told her that Monique had a third adult son, Jean-Luc, who had not gone to the party in Paris. If Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to have seen Monique alive. And that meant he could even be her killer. The next morning, Captain P led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchier part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment. A moment later, a young man answered. After confirming his identity, two officers escorted a very confused Jean-Luc away to be questioned back at the police station. Meanwhile, Captain P and the forensics team went inside to search his apartment. It didn't take long to find something. As Captain P was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something he'd found. She walked over to him and saw he had his flashlight out, and he was pointing the beam at a spot on the wall near the staircase. When she got close enough to see, she could make out what appeared to be tiny, dried droplets of blood. Captain P pulled out her own flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor, looking for any more potential evidence. She found a few more reddish droplets near the doorknob of a closet. She opened the closet door, and inside, leaning against the back wall, was a bicycle. She shined her flashlight over the bike, looking at the wheels and the frame. And then she saw it. There were reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of the bike, as if whoever had ridden it last had driven right through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Captain P walked into an interrogation room at the police station. Jean-Luc was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and his face was a mask of fear and confusion. Captain P sat down across from him and got straight to the point. She asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7. Jean-Luc explained that he had just stopped by for a visit after work, something he did often. He said he only stayed for about half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Captain P asked him if he had gone straight to his own apartment afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, a man named Christophe, lived in the same apartment building on the floor directly below them. So, before going upstairs to his own unit, he had stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes. After that, he said he spent the rest of the night in his apartment with his wife. To Captain P, it felt like there had to be more to the story. They had found what looked like blood in his apartment and what looked like a lot more blood on his bike. She figured that if she pushed him hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So, she told him point blank that they had found blood in his living room and that it was being sent to the lab for analysis. When Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red. He began to stammer, explaining that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting their apartment a few days earlier. Captain P nodded, but then she told him they had also found what looked like blood all over his bicycle. Jean-Luc hesitated. He stuttered and stammered, but couldn't seem to come up with any explanation for that. At this point, Captain P felt like she had him cornered. She told him to be quiet for a moment and to roll up his sleeves so she could see his arms. Captain P knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she had fought back hard. She must have left at least a few scratches or bruises on her attacker. However, when Jean-Luc finally rolled up his sleeves, Captain P saw that his hands and forearms were completely clear. There wasn't a single scratch or bruise on him. A few minutes later, Captain P left the interrogation room and walked back to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was still acting incredibly suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go just yet. But she also knew she couldn't afford to get tunnel vision. She didn't want to completely ignore other potential suspects, just in case the blood in Jean-Luc's apartment turned out to be a strange coincidence. So, she sat down at her desk, opened a file, and began flipping through the notes from interviews her team had already conducted with the rest of Monique's family and neighbors. Monique's other sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had already spoken to all of the stepdaughters as well as their husbands. And even though some of them admitted they still had issues with Monique, every single one of them had a solid alibi for the night Monique was killed. Several other family members had also mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had already tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had told them that for the most part, she and Monique stayed out of each other's way. They hadn't even seen each other in over a month. And besides that, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4 foot 9 inches tall, she was 58 years old, and just seemed very weak. It seemed almost impossible that she could have physically overpowered the much larger Monique, inflicted such horrific injury, and then dragged her body out to the front yard. It just didn't seem plausible. So, while she wasn't completely ruled out, she was very low on the list of suspects. Just then, there was a knock on Captain P's office door. She looked up and saw another officer standing there. He told her there were 2 people in the station who wanted to speak with her. Captain P nodded. A moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman were shown into her office. They sat down across the desk from her, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Loon investigation. Captain P sat up straight, grabbed her notepad, and said, "Okay, tell me what you have." She began writing, as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe, Jean-Luc's brother-in-law. Captain P immediately recognized the name. That was the person Jean-Luc claimed to have visited on the night of the murder, right after leaving his mother's house. The man sitting across from her said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's phone number, but when he answered it, all he could hear was that muffled conversation between 2 women. At first, the man thought it was just an accidental call, maybe made by one of Christophe's kids playing with the phone. However, the man said when he put the phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman with him now, both started listening very closely, and they were able to make out snippets of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi, and they said something about a man named Jean-Luc. The couple had heard one woman say something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Captain P could not believe what she was hearing. Any lingering doubts she might have had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much vanished in that moment. She took down the couple's names and contact information, showed them out of her office, and as soon as they were gone, she grabbed her keys and headed straight for Christophe's apartment. By this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned. He had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the strange phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Captain P hoped that a search of his apartment might tell a different story. She walked through each room of the small apartment until she found the laundry area. She put on a pair of latex gloves, opened the washing machine, and reached inside. She pulled out a pair of men's pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. She held the pants up to the light, and she could clearly see a brownish stain on one of the legs. She also noticed that the pants looked like they would be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and heavy-set guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a smaller man, a man like Jean-Luc. Later that same day, which was now February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain P was back in her office when her phone rang. She answered it. It was a technician from the crime lab calling to tell her that they already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. Captain P braced herself, ready to hear the case-breaking news she was expecting. But what the tech told her was not what she expected at all. He said that the stains on the bicycle were indeed blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood found in Jean-Luc's apartment, the ones on the walls and near the closet door, were human blood, but they were not a match for Monique. And then he told her that the stain on the pants they had found in the washing machine wasn't blood at all. It was just grease. Captain P was incredibly frustrated. In her mind, she had completely zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now, they had absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the crime. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those 2 women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had overheard the conversation correctly. Maybe they had misheard the part about the alibi, or the part about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knew if they had actually heard that? Captain P thanked the lab technician for the update, as disappointing as it was. She was about to hang up when he told her to wait, that he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had found something significant. they had found DNA under Monique's fingernails. It was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it properly. But once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects and hopefully find a match. This gave Captain P a new sense of hope. After she hung up the phone, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from. She knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and from Christophe. And that neighbor, Henri, still seemed like a strong suspect too. Captain P had spoken to Henri's wife, who confirmed that they were together the whole night Monique was killed. But she also knew that spouses often lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi at best. At this point, Captain P felt like she had 3 decent potential suspects to get DNA from, but that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point. None of the other neighbors seemed like viable suspects, and by all accounts, Monique lived a quiet suburban life and didn't really have any enemies. So, there was no one else. To Captain P, it felt like there was a huge piece of the puzzle missing. She thought to herself that in the time she had while waiting for the DNA analysis, she needed to go back over everything and see if there was something she had overlooked. And so, over the next few weeks, that's exactly what Captain P did. She pored over all the evidence they had collected. She re-interviewed all the family members. She spoke to all the neighbors again. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that pointed to any other suspects. And then, in early March, about 3 or 4 weeks after that first call, Captain P got another call from the crime lab. The technician on the line told her that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they had tested it against any of their specific suspects, the initial results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Captain P heard what the technician had to say, she realized that this was it. This was the missing piece of information she had been looking for all along. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and an eventual confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Linné on the night of the 7th of February 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting her visitor inside, Monique just stood there with her arms crossed, staring. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then, at some point during the argument, Monique slammed the door right in the killer's face. But just before she did, she said one last thing, something that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. Without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this final cutting remark, stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby. They reached under the driver's seat and grabbed a knife they kept there for self-defense. They carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. As soon as the door opened a second time, the killer pushed their way inside. And with a surge of uncontrollable rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was a strong, large woman, and she fought back with everything she had. She managed to knock the killer to the ground and actually pin them there. But the killer wrestled their arm free, the one that was holding the knife, and continued the attack. Monique kept fighting back. It was an epic, desperate struggle. And the whole time this was happening, Monique's 4 dogs, who were behind the baby gate just a few feet away, were watching everything. They were barking like mad. Monique was screaming out in rage and pain and panic. Finally, the killer was able to break away from Monique, who had them pinned despite being stabbed repeatedly. Once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got into their vehicle, and started to pull away from the curb. And as they did, they looked back and saw Monique stumble out of her front door. She took a few steps down the walkway, and then she collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. They drove to a nearby supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, into a large trash can. Then the killer went home and they burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this horrific crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were the last person anyone would ever suspect of such a violent murder. It would turn out that the killer was the 4 foot 9 inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed that she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally try and bury the hatchet after years and years of feuding between the two sides of the family. But she said the bad blood ran too deep. And when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the final inflammatory line as she shut the door. Beatrice said that in that moment, she just snapped. Beatrice had initially been ruled out as a suspect, primarily because she was just so small. She seemed too small to have overpowered Monique, and definitely too small to have moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out that Monique's body was not moved at all. She had stumbled out into the yard herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after the attack that she had managed to chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And she did this after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside the house. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to scratch her attacker, getting traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. The initial DNA analysis immediately showed that the killer was a woman, and further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out for sure who made that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, but their best guess was that the women who were overheard on the phone were Christophe's mother and sister, and it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker had simply misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on the 29th of March 2003. She confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted that confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.